The hum of Silverwind Airport was as steady as always, a continuous blend of rolling suitcases, overlapping announcements, and the murmur of thousands of travelers moving through its expansive halls. Morris Watson, 29, a security officer who had worked here for 5 years, arrived at his early morning shift, barely noticing the routine buzz anymore. Silverwind had become a second home, familiar and predictable, yet somehow untouched by the lives and stories passing through it each day. Dressed in his crisp blue and black uniform, Morris adjusted his radio, scanned the arrivals hall, and mentally prepared for another routine day. It was a job he took seriously, but the novelty of watching the human tapestry of greetings and farewells had long faded. His responsibilities varied, from handling minor squabbles to diffusing tense situations with confused or lost travelers. Occasionally, there were moments that caught him off guard, but he expected today to be just like any other. He was about to start his rounds when he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on one of the airport's benches near the large digital board displaying arrival and departure times. The man's posture was slightly hunched but dignified, a sense of quiet resilience surrounding him. He wore a finely pressed beige jacket and polished shoes, his attire neatly put together, despite the air of quiet weariness that clung to him. In his lap rested a bouquet of red roses, their vibrant color standing out against the bustling, neutral backdrop of the terminal. Morris's steps slowed. There was something about the man that held his attention, something beyond the usual array of travelers. As he scanned the man's features, he saw a mixture of hope, worry, and perhaps even a trace of sadness. Morris wondered briefly if the man was waiting for someone he hadn't seen in a long time, or if perhaps this was part of some grand reunion. Before Morris could continue his routine, the man caught his eye and gestured for him to come closer. His gaze was steady yet gentle, and there was a certain urgency behind his polite wave. Morris approached, curiosity piqued, and the man smiled, revealing the warmth that contrasted with his otherwise solemn expression. "Good morning, young man," the elderly man began, his voice clear but gentle, like a grandfather addressing a loved one. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you might help me with something." Morris nodded, caught by the man's humble tone. "Of course, sir. What can I help you with?" The man glanced down at the roses, and for a fleeting moment, Morris noticed his fingers tighten around the bouquet. "I'm waiting for someone, a dear friend," he said. "Her flight should have arrived by now. It's Flight 223. I wouldn't want to miss her for the world." Flight 223. Morris's mind ran through the day's schedule. He didn't have the exact timing of every flight memorized, but something felt odd. He didn't recall seeing that flight listed in the morning arrivals. "Let me double-check the schedule for you," Morris replied, gesturing to the nearby board. "The arrivals board should have the latest information." The man's eyes followed Morris's gesture, and a look of anxiety flickered across his face before he managed a grateful nod. "Thank you. It's just that. She promised she'd be here. I may be a bit early, I suppose, but I couldn't bear to be late. It's been far too long." The man's words, though simple, struck Morris as unusually profound. There was a story here, he was sure of it, but out of respect, he chose not to pry further. Instead, he offered the man a comforting smile. "You'll be the first to see her when she arrives, sir. I'll check in on you a bit later, just to make sure everything's all right." With that, Morris continued his rounds, though he found himself glancing back at the elderly man several times, each look revealing the man in the same position, eyes fixed on the arrivals area. His anticipation was almost palpable, his fingers gently adjusting the roses as he waited. Morris felt an odd sense of connection with the man, something beyond the usual passing encounters he experienced with travelers. The day passed in its usual rhythm, with Morris fielding security calls and handling minor issues. Yet, as the hours ticked by, he found himself growing increasingly curious about the elderly man's wait. He caught sight of him now and then, still on the bench, occasionally glancing around but always returning his focus to the arrivals hall. Each time, Morris noted that the roses had grown slightly more wilted, their vibrant red beginning to fade in the afternoon's warm light. As Morris's shift drew closer to an end, he made his way back toward the arrivals hall. The crowd had thinned considerably, the once bustling terminal now hosting only a handful of passengers. He looked toward the bench, half expecting the man to be gone, reunited with the person he had waited for so patiently. But instead, he found him still there, his figure slightly slouched, eyes still scanning the now emptying hall. Morris couldn't hold back his concern any longer. He approached the man, the weight of his growing curiosity and worry pressing him forward. "Sir," he asked gently. The man looked up, his face bearing a hint of weariness, but retaining its quiet hope. "Have you found the person you were waiting for?" The man gave a small shake of his head. "Not yet, but I'm certain she'll come." His voice was soft but firm, though Morris detected a slight tremor that betrayed his doubt. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The conviction in his tone only deepened Morris's concern. Something wasn't adding up, and a strange pang settled in his chest. What if this man had been misinformed? Or worse, what if he had been forgotten? "Would you like me to help you check if there's been an update on the flight status?" Morris asked, hoping to provide some reassurance. But the man gave a polite wave of his hand. No, he replied with a gentle smile, though his gaze betrayed a hint of loneliness Morris hadn't noticed before. "She'll come when she's ready." Morris nodded, respecting the man's resolve, yet feeling a nagging need to stay connected with him. "All right, sir. I'll be nearby if you need anything," he said. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than a simple delay. That night, as Morris lay in bed, he found himself unable to rest. Thoughts of the elderly man, waiting alone with his roses, lingered in his mind, unsettling his usual sense of peace. The man's hope had been infectious, his politeness a rare quality in the fast-paced, often impatient world of the airport. But it was the unspoken story behind his wait that haunted Morris, filling him with an inexplicable drive to uncover the truth. And with that resolve, Morris drifted into a restless sleep, determined to check on the man again the next day, certain that his own life was about to take an unexpected turn. The morning sun was barely starting to rise as Morris Watson walked back into Silverwind Airport, his mind still preoccupied with the mysterious elderly man he'd encountered the day before. Morris had tried to shake off the worry, reasoning that everyone in an airport had a story, each with its own complexities and emotions. But something about this man, his gentle persistence, and the sad determination in his eyes, lingered. He'd hardly slept the night before, his dreams a jumbled blur of airport terminals and withering roses. The man's face kept appearing, sometimes hopeful, sometimes forlorn. Each dream was filled with a quiet, urgent sense of waiting that left Morris unsettled. As he made his way through the morning crowds, Morris tried to focus on his duties, yet found himself glancing toward the same bench where he had first seen the elderly man. Even from a distance, Morris could make out the figure sitting there, and his heart sank. The man was back, or maybe he had never left. This time, his head was bowed, and the once vibrant bouquet of roses lay beside him, visibly wilted. Morris approached, a sense of dread and compassion mingling in his chest. He reminded himself that it was his job to help people, to ensure the safety and well-being of travelers. But this felt different. It felt personal. "Good morning, sir," Morris said softly as he reached the man's side. The elderly gentleman looked up slowly, as if dragged out of a deep thought. His face, though still dignified, bore a weariness that tugged at Morris's heart. It was a look of long-held patience, of unyielding hope in the face of unspoken disappointment. Despite the sadness in his eyes, the man greeted Morris with a small, polite smile. "Ah, it's you again," he said, a faint spark of recognition flickering across his face. "Thank you for checking on me. I'm still waiting." Morris hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You've been here since yesterday, sir. Are you sure everything is all right? Maybe I could help you get in touch with someone. Or perhaps you need something to eat." The man shook his head gently, his expression resolute but grateful. "I appreciate it, young man, truly. But I'm just waiting. I promised her I'd be here, and I intend to keep my word." Morris's mind raced. He couldn't help but feel a growing concern for this stranger, a stranger who had somehow become more than just a traveler in a crowd. There was something almost sacred about the man's wait, like an unbreakable vow he was determined to fulfill. "Sir, I'm sorry if I'm overstepping, but sometimes flights can be delayed or rescheduled. Are you certain she's coming today?" The man's gaze softened, and a shadow of sadness clouded his eyes. "I understand your concern, but she'll come. It's just taking longer than expected." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You see, I haven't seen her in over 40 years. Life took us in different directions, but we made a promise, her and I. She said if I ever wanted to see her again, she'd meet me here at Silverwind, on this very bench." Morris's heart ached at the quiet conviction in the man's voice. This wasn't just a simple meeting or reunion. It was a lifetime of hope and loyalty wrapped up in a single act of waiting. He wanted to probe further, but the man's composed yet fragile demeanor held him back. "I'll make sure you're comfortable, sir. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask," Morris offered, not wanting to leave him without support. He left feeling a strange mix of emotions: respect, sadness, and a growing sense of responsibility for the man's well-being. Throughout the day, Morris kept a close eye on the elderly man, catching glimpses of him during his rounds. The man barely moved, his gaze fixed on the arrivals area, his fingers occasionally adjusting the now-fading roses. Morris's concern deepened with every hour, watching as the man's posture grew slightly more slouched, his eyes dimmer. Each time Morris passed, the man would give him a nod or a polite wave, yet he never called him over or asked for anything. By mid-afternoon, Morris could no longer keep his concern in check. He approached the elderly man again, determined to learn more about his situation. "Sir, I don't mean to pry, but you mentioned it's been 40 years since you last saw her. Are you absolutely certain she'll be able to find you here?" Morris asked, doing his best to convey his question with compassion. The man looked up at him, a mixture of melancholy and pride in his eyes. "Yes, I'm certain. We both loved Silverwind Airport. We'd watch the planes come and go, dreaming about the places they'd take us. This place was like a promise to us, a promise that someday, no matter what happened, we'd see each other again. I believe in that promise, no matter how much time has passed." Morris's throat tightened at the words. It was the kind of love and loyalty he had only read about in books, a devotion that seemed impossible in today's fast-paced, transient world. He felt compelled to honor the man's faith, yet an uneasy thought nagged at him. What if she never came? What if the man's wait was in vain, his hope clinging to a promise long broken by time? Morris stayed nearby as his shift continued, half-heartedly attending to his duties while keeping an eye on the man. Several times, he approached with offers of food or water, each time met with a polite decline. The elderly man's patience was both inspiring and heart-wrenching, his faith unwavering despite the growing emptiness of the terminal. As evening drew near, Morris knew he couldn't leave without speaking to the man one last time. He approached with an internal resolution, prepared to offer whatever assistance was necessary. "Sir, it's almost closing time. Are you sure you don't need any help? Maybe a way to contact someone or a place to stay for the night?" Morris asked gently, hoping to ease his burden. The man gave him a weary smile, his eyes filled with a sadness that spoke volumes. "Thank you, young man. You've been so kind. But this is where I belong for now. She'll come. I'm sure of it." His words were soft, but there was a resolve in his tone that Morris dared not challenge. The thought of leaving him alone for another night tugged at Morris's conscience, but the man's unyielding determination was clear, and Morris respected his wishes, though he couldn't shake the heavy feeling settling in his chest. As he made his way to the exit, Morris took one last look back, the elderly man's solitary figure a haunting image that stayed with him. That night, Morris couldn't find rest. The man's story was like a thread woven into his thoughts, pulling him back to the man's hopeful wait and the bouquet of roses that seemed to mirror his resilience. He wondered if there was a way to help the man, a way to find the person he was waiting for, to give him the reunion he so clearly cherished. Driven by a sense of responsibility he couldn't fully explain, Morris made a promise to himself as he lay awake. Tomorrow, he would find a way to help the man, whether it was tracking down his long-lost companion or helping him understand the reality of his wait. Morris knew he couldn't simply stand by and do nothing. He owed it to the man's faith, to the memory of his grandmother's lonely last years, and to his own conscience. As dawn broke, Morris rose with a renewed sense of purpose. He'd arrive at the airport early, prepared to dig deeper into the mystery, and to honor the man's wait, no matter what it would require of him. The following morning, Morris arrived at Silverwind Airport even earlier than usual. The airport was still quiet, the only sounds being the muffled hum of cleaning machines and the occasional footsteps of staff preparing for the day. Yet, despite the calm, Morris's heart beat heavily. He was determined to get answers, to find some way to ease the mind of the elderly man whose presence now felt as familiar as a colleague's. As he walked toward the arrivals hall, Morris felt a strange mix of hope and dread. He wanted, more than anything, to see the elderly man smiling beside a long-lost friend, relieved of his lonely vigil. But if he wasn't, Morris didn't want to think about that. He turned the corner to the arrivals bench, and there he was, seated just as before. The man's posture was slightly more hunched, his eyes lined with weariness, yet he still cradled the wilted roses as if they were as fresh as the day he brought them. Morris's heart clenched, both in admiration and sadness, at the quiet determination on the elderly man's face. "Good morning, sir," Morris greeted gently. The man looked up, his eyes momentarily brightening with recognition. "Ah, it's you again," he replied, a faint but genuine smile gracing his face. "Thank you for stopping by. I suppose you're surprised to see me here once more." Morris managed a small laugh, nodding. "I was hoping that today might be different, that perhaps you'd found who you were waiting for. Has there been any news on her flight?" The elderly man sighed, the sound carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "No news yet, but that's all right. Patience is something I've never been short on." He gave a small chuckle, though Morris sensed a growing fragility in his voice. Morris decided to take a different approach. "Sir, would you mind sharing more about who you're waiting for? Maybe if I know a little more, I could help you find some information." The man hesitated, a shadow of reluctance passing over his face before he nodded. "I suppose there's no harm in telling you. Her name is Evelyn Brooks. We met when we were just young teenagers, two souls with grand dreams, two kids who thought the world was a place of endless wonder." The man's eyes grew distant, his gaze fixed on memories only he could see. Morris sat down beside him, the story pulling him in. He found himself captivated by the raw honesty in the man's voice, the way each word seemed to come from a place of profound reverence. "We were each other's first loves, but life has a way of steering people down different paths," the man continued, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I went into the military, and she moved to another city for work. For years, we stayed in touch, writing letters, making promises to meet. But life was relentless. New careers, family obligations, and responsibilities got in the way. And before we knew it, decades had passed." Morris could feel the weight of those years, the quiet grief hidden beneath the man's composed expression. "So you made a promise to meet here, at this airport?" Morris asked softly. "Yes," the man replied, his voice barely a whisper. 40 years ago, on a summer night, we made a pact. If either of us wanted to see the other, we would come to Silverwind Airport and wait on this very bench. No questions, no explanations, just a silent promise that we'd be here when it mattered." Morris felt his chest tighten, struck by the unyielding faith the man had placed in that promise. To wait year after year, holding on to the hope that one day she would walk through those doors, it was the kind of devotion Morris had rarely encountered in his own life. "And so you've been waiting here for her, every day?" Morris asked, feeling a strange urgency building within him. He wanted to help, to do something, anything, to bring resolution to the man's story. The elderly man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the doors of the arrivals hall. "This isn't the first day I've waited here," he admitted. "Every year, around the same time, I come here and wait, just in case. Perhaps it's foolish," he added, giving a wistful smile. "But I promised, and that's enough for me." Morris sat in silence, absorbing the man's words. The depth of his commitment, the quiet fortitude with which he faced his wait, was nothing short of remarkable. Morris could see that this wasn't just a reunion. It was a testament to a bond that had endured the relentless passage of time. But Morris knew there were limits too. The elderly man's fragile health and the visible toll of his long wait weighed heavily on him. As a security officer, Morris had resources at his disposal, ways to gather information if needed. Perhaps, he thought, he could help the man find out if Evelyn was still out there, or at least offer him the closure he deserved. "I might be able to help you find her, sir," Morris offered cautiously. "If you have any other information about her, maybe an old address or contact, I could try looking it up." The man's face lit up with a brief glimmer of hope, but then he shook his head. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know where to start. It's been too many years, and I've never been much for technology." He gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. "But thank you, son. Your kindness means more than you know." Morris's mind raced with possibilities. He didn't want to overstep, yet he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the man to his silent vigil without trying. Perhaps he could look into local records, or even reach out to community organizations who might be able to locate someone with Evelyn's name. "All right," Morris said finally. "If you don't mind, I'll do a little research. Just don't hesitate to ask if you need anything, sir." As he rose to continue his shift, he felt the elderly man's gentle touch on his arm, a faint squeeze of gratitude that spoke volumes. Morris gave him a reassuring nod, promising silently that he wouldn't let the man's story end here. Throughout the day, Morris kept one ear to his security radio and one eye on his phone, scrolling through local directories and contact lists, hoping for some clue that might help him locate Evelyn. He felt a strange sense of urgency, as if each hour he waited added to the years the elderly man had already spent waiting. After his shift, he spent several more hours researching, his determination growing with each dead end he encountered. Morris even contacted a local community center, hoping they might have records of someone with Evelyn's name who could still be in the area. Yet, as the evening wore on, he came up empty-handed. The feeling of frustration gnawed at him, mingling with the image of the elderly man's hopeful face. He knew he couldn't give up, even if it meant pursuing every possible lead in the coming days. The next morning, Morris arrived at Silverwind with a renewed sense of resolve. This time, he had prepared a few questions, hoping to gently encourage the man to share any other details that might help in his search. As he neared the arrivals bench, he saw the elderly man once again seated, his head resting against the wall, a look of exhaustion etched into his features. Morris approached, his voice gentle. "Good morning, sir." The elderly man's eyes opened, a faint smile breaking through his weariness. "You're back," he said softly. "I suppose you'll be leaving for the day soon." Morris hesitated, his resolve only growing. "Actually, I wanted to ask you a bit more about your friend. Perhaps a few details might help us locate her." The man looked at him, a spark of hope mingling with caution. "Thank you, son. I appreciate it. I can't offer much, but perhaps there's something that might help." With that, they began a careful recounting of memories, each detail adding to the fragile puzzle Morris was trying to assemble. He learned about the small town where Evelyn had grown up, the letters they had exchanged, the few friends they'd shared. By the time their conversation ended, Morris felt a renewed hope that perhaps with these clues, he could finally give the elderly man the answer he had been waiting for. As Morris left the airport that evening, his heart was heavy with a strange mixture of hope and determination. He knew the journey to finding Evelyn wouldn't be easy, but for the sake of the elderly man's faith, he was willing to go the distance. Tomorrow, he'd continue his search, a quiet promise to himself that he'd uncover the truth, whatever it might be. The morning air was cool and damp as Morris Watson made his way to Silverwind Airport, the weight of his mission pressing heavily on his mind. Today, he had arrived with a stack of notes, contact details, and a series of questions he hoped might uncover some clue about Evelyn's whereabouts. The thought of helping this elderly man, who had spent countless hours waiting for a single reunion, had transformed Morris's routine into something that felt both urgent and personal. As he stepped into the arrivals hall, Morris scanned the familiar scene, his eyes locking onto the elderly man almost immediately. There he sat, his figure slightly more hunched, a sign of both age and exhaustion, yet still cradling the wilting bouquet of roses as if they were as fresh as the day he'd bought them. Morris noted the tremor in the man's hands, the way his gaze drifted with an air of expectation toward each new face that walked through the terminal. "Good morning, sir," Morris greeted softly as he approached. The man looked up, his weary face lighting up with a familiar, gentle smile. "Ah, young man," the elderly gentleman replied, his voice tinged with the faint hope Morris had come to recognize. "Thank you for coming by. I suppose you must think me terribly foolish, sitting here day after day." "Not at all," Morris said, taking the seat beside him. "In fact, I've been doing a bit of research. I was wondering if you'd mind telling me more about Evelyn. Anything that might help me find her. Even small details can make a big difference." The man hesitated, the shadow of doubt flickering across his face, but then he nodded, a look of quiet gratitude in his eyes. "I don't have much to offer, but I can tell you a bit more about her." As the man began to recount memories of Evelyn, Morris listened intently, scribbling notes, hoping each word might reveal a new lead. He learned that Evelyn had worked as a teacher at a small local school before moving to a nearby city. She had been passionate about books and children, spending her free time volunteering at libraries and community centers. The more he spoke, the more Morris began to understand the deep connection between them. "She loved children," the man said with a faint smile, his voice soft with remembrance. "We often spoke of what it would be like to have a family of our own, but we were young, and life had different plans for us. Still, she would write to me every few months, sharing her dreams, her travels, everything, until one day, the letters simply stopped." Morris noted the shift in the man's tone, the sorrow that crept into his words. "Did you ever find out why she stopped writing?" he asked, sensing that the answer might hold a vital piece of the puzzle. The man shook his head, his gaze distant. "No, I wrote to her address, but the letters were returned. I tried calling, but it seemed her number had changed. I assumed she had simply moved on, that perhaps she found someone else, built a life that didn't have room for our promises." There was a deep sadness in his voice, a resignation that tugged at Morris's heart. He could feel the weight of those unanswered questions, the lingering doubts that had likely haunted the man for years. But Morris was determined to go further, to find some way of reconnecting this man with the one person who had meant so much to him. "Do you remember her last address?" Morris asked gently, hoping to trace her steps, even if it meant a dead end. The man nodded, his brow furrowing as he recited an address from memory, one Morris quickly jotted down. It was a small apartment near Greenfield. She had just moved there when I last heard from her. I went there once to surprise her, but I found the place empty. She had already moved out. Morris took a deep breath, feeling the pang of disappointment, yet unwilling to give up. Greenfield wasn't far, and with the address, he could at least try to contact someone in the area who might remember Evelyn. "Thank you, sir. I'll see if I can find anything," Morris promised, standing up and giving the man a reassuring nod. "In the meantime, I'll check on you throughout the day. Please let me know if you need anything at all." The man looked up at him, a flicker of gratitude shining through his weariness. "Thank you, young man. It means the world to me, even if it comes to nothing. I appreciate your kindness." Morris left the airport feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He made his way to Greenfield that afternoon, his mind racing with possibilities. The address was located in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, the kind where faces were familiar and everyone knew one another's routines. When he arrived at the small apartment building, he noticed its worn exterior, the faded paint, and the old mailbox lined with dust. He approached the manager's office, hoping for a shred of information about Evelyn's past residency. An older woman greeted him, her gaze curious but welcoming. Morris explained his visit, carefully recounting the man's story without revealing too many personal details. As he mentioned Evelyn's name, the woman's expression softened, a look of recognition crossing her face. "Evelyn Brooks," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Yes, I remember her. She lived here years ago. A lovely young woman, always smiling, always helping out with the neighborhood kids. I used to see her with books, reading to them on weekends." Morris felt a surge of hope. "Do you know where she went? Any family or friends she might have kept in contact with?" The woman's face fell slightly. "I'm afraid she left rather suddenly. One day, she just moved out without much explanation. I remember she mentioned wanting to take a teaching position in another city, but I don't know if she ever did. She left behind a few things. Actually, a box of old letters and papers. I never had the heart to throw them out. They're in storage, if you'd like to take a look." Morris's pulse quickened as she led him to a dusty storage room, opening a small cardboard box labeled E. Brooks. Inside, Morris found a few personal belongings, an old photograph of Evelyn, her smiling face surrounded by young children, a few books with her notes scrawled in the margins, and a collection of faded letters bound by a fragile ribbon. He carefully opened the letters, his eyes scanning each word, noting the poetic language and deep affection that flowed through each one. They were from the elderly man, penned with a tenderness that spoke of a love undiminished by time. Morris felt a strange sense of reverence, almost as if he were intruding on a sacred space, but he knew these letters might hold the answers the man was seeking. At the bottom of the stack, Morris found a final letter, unopened, addressed to the elderly man in shaky, delicate handwriting. The envelope was brittle, its corners frayed from age, but it was intact. He held it carefully, his mind racing. It was dated nearly 40 years ago, the last letter Evelyn had written before she disappeared. Morris knew he couldn't open it, that it belonged to the man who had waited so faithfully. Clutching the letter, he thanked the woman profusely and made his way back to Silverwind Airport, his heart pounding with both excitement and apprehension. He had a piece of Evelyn's past, a fragment of the life she had left behind. And with it, perhaps the answer the elderly man had sought for so many years. By the time he returned to the arrivals hall, the sun was dipping low, casting a warm glow over the terminal. Morris spotted the elderly man instantly, his figure still and composed, though his hands trembled slightly as he cradled the roses. The man looked up as Morris approached, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ah, young man, you've come back," he said, his voice soft but hopeful. Morris took a deep breath, sitting down beside him. "I found something, sir," he said, carefully pulling out the letter. "It's from Evelyn. I didn't open it. I thought you should have the honor." The man's eyes widened, his hands reaching out with a mixture of awe and disbelief. His fingers traced the envelope, his breath catching as he recognized the familiar handwriting. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I never thought. After all this time." With trembling hands, he carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the delicate paper inside. Morris watched, feeling the weight of the moment, the air thick with anticipation. The man read the letter silently, his eyes moving slowly over each word, a cascade of emotions crossing his face: hope, sorrow, and something deeper, more profound. After what felt like an eternity, the man looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He folded the letter, clutching it to his chest, his expression both peaceful and heartbroken. "She loved me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "All these years, I never knew she loved me." Morris placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his own heart heavy with the revelation. He wanted to ask more, to understand what the letter had said, but he knew this was a private moment, a memory to be cherished. "Thank you, young man," the elderly man finally said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "You've given me something I thought I had lost forever. You've brought me peace." Morris nodded, feeling both humbled and deeply moved. He knew, without a doubt, that this moment would stay with him forever, a testament to the enduring power of love and loyalty, of promises kept across a lifetime. And though Evelyn had not walked through the doors of Silverwind Airport, Morris felt that in some way she was there, her spirit woven into every word of the letter, her love reaching across the years to embrace the man who had waited for her so faithfully. The terminal had grown quiet, the late afternoon sun casting a warm, golden glow over the nearly empty hall. Morris Watson sat silently beside the elderly man, whose hands were still clutching the delicate letter from Evelyn. The weight of the years, the sacrifices, and the moments they had missed hung in the air, almost palpable. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Morris could see the internal struggle in the elderly man's eyes, a deep-seated conflict between the comfort of finding closure and the sadness of what could have been. Each line of the letter had brought Evelyn closer, but also underlined the chasm of time that now lay between them. After a while, the man let out a soft sigh, loosening his grip on the letter and smoothing its fragile creases. His face, though still touched by sadness, bore a look of acceptance Morris hadn't seen before. It was as if the letter had settled something deep within him, offering a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you, young man," he finally said, his voice steady but filled with quiet reverence. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Morris shook his head gently. "There's no need for repayment, sir. I'm just grateful I could help in some way. I can only imagine what this must mean to you." The elderly man nodded, his gaze drifting to the roses he still held. I never thought I'd see her words again. It's strange, isn't it? A single letter, after all these years, and yet it's like she's sitting right here beside me." He carefully unfolded the letter once more, reading aloud with a voice thick with emotion. "My dearest Henry, I write this letter, hoping you will find it one day, in case I am ever unable to tell you myself. Life has taken us both down different paths, but my heart has never let you go. Every day, in some small way, I think of you. I wonder if you remember the promises we made, the hopes we shared. I wonder if you still sit on our favorite bench at Silverwind, watching the plains, dreaming of places we could see together." Henry paused, his voice trembling as he continued. "If you're reading this, it means I may not have been able to keep my promise. I wish with all my heart that I could be there beside you, but sometimes life doesn't allow us to choose. Know that my love for you never faded. It stayed, like a quiet whisper, through every decision, every step I took. Please forgive me, and remember me with love, as I will remember you. With all my heart, Evelyn." A tear slid down Henry's cheek as he folded the letter again, holding it close to his chest. Morris watched, feeling the power of the words settle between them, a bridge spanning 4 decades of hope, regret, and unwavering love. "She loved me all this time," Henry murmured, his eyes brimming with gratitude and a bittersweet joy. "Even after all these years, she remembered me. She thought of me." Morris felt a swell of emotion at the sight, a deep respect for the resilience of love and the bonds that endure even in separation. He'd often wondered about such things, about how people who drift apart could still hold each other so dearly in their hearts, even after life had pulled them in different directions. In that moment, he felt he was witnessing a rare, timeless devotion that defied the constraints of time and distance. "Henry," Morris began gently, "it seems that your wait wasn't in vain. She may not be here with you, but her words have reached you. She loved you as deeply as you loved her." Henry nodded, his gaze still fixed on the letter. "Yes, it's as if she's here, telling me that everything will be okay. I can feel her love in these words, her kindness, her patience. It's like I've finally come home." Morris hesitated before asking the question that had been lingering in his mind. "Would you like to keep waiting here, sir? I don't want to intrude, but now that you have her letter, perhaps you might consider a place where you'll be more comfortable." Henry thought for a long moment, his expression pensive. "You're right, young man. Perhaps I should. Perhaps it's time for me to go. I've held on to this bench, this airport, like it was all I had of her. But now," he held up the letter, his eyes bright with a fragile hope. "Now, I think I have all I need." Morris felt a sense of relief mingling with his admiration. The elderly man, whose wait had once seemed endless, now carried a look of closure, an acceptance that Morris had hoped he would find. But Morris also knew that letting go wasn't easy, especially when someone had anchored their life to a single promise for so long. "Let me help you gather your things, Henry," Morris offered, rising and gently taking the small overnight bag the elderly man had kept at his side. They walked slowly through the terminal, Henry leaning on Morris's arm for support. Morris couldn't help but feel a quiet pride, knowing he played a small part in helping this man find peace. It was as though he were walking alongside history, witnessing the close of a love story that had endured the tests of time and fate. As they neared the exit, Henry paused, turning to look at the arrivals hall one last time. His eyes swept over the rows of benches, the hum of bustling travelers, and the large windows casting shadows across the polished floors. Morris watched as a peaceful smile crossed Henry's face, a look of finality in his gaze. "This is it," Henry murmured. "Goodbye, Silverwind. Goodbye to the waiting, the questions. I think I'm finally ready to move on." They stepped outside into the fading light, and Morris guided him to a waiting cab. Before climbing in, Henry turned, placing a hand on Morris's shoulder. "You've given me more than you know, Morris," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Without you, I would still be there, waiting for a moment that might never come. Thank you for bringing Evelyn back to me." Morris felt his throat tighten, moved by the sincerity in Henry's words. "It was an honor, Henry. You reminded me that love doesn't fade with time. It only grows stronger. I'm glad you found your peace." Henry smiled, his face softening with warmth. "Take care, young man. And remember, sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones that bring us back to those we cherish most." With that, he climbed into the cab, clutching the letter as if it were a precious relic. Morris watched as the car pulled away, a sense of fulfillment and melancholy settling over him. He stood there for a moment, gazing after the retreating vehicle, his heart full of admiration for the man who had held on to hope for so long. As Morris turned to head back inside, he felt a wave of introspection wash over him. The encounter with Henry had left him with a newfound respect for the resilience of love, for the small promises that can shape the course of a lifetime. In his line of work, he'd seen the transient nature of human connections, the fleeting goodbyes and brief reunions. But Henry's story had shown him a different kind of love, a steadfast, quiet devotion that survived the tests of time and distance. He returned to his post in the security office, his mind still replaying the details of Henry's story. As he glanced at the arrivals hall, he felt a subtle change in the way he viewed his surroundings. Each face, each waiting figure, seemed to hold a story, a depth of feeling that transcended the mundane details of daily life. He understood now that behind every traveler, every embrace, was a narrative waiting to be told. And so, as Morris resumed his duties, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He had witnessed the culmination of a love story that had spanned decades, had played a part in helping a man find peace, and in turn had discovered something about himself, the value of compassion, of patience, and the quiet strength in the act of waiting. Silverwind Airport continued to hum with activity, but for Morris, The world had subtly shifted. He knew he would carry Henry's story with him, a reminder that some promises, no matter how long they are kept, have the power to change lives in ways both profound and unseen. And with that, Morris Watson returned to his station, a quiet smile lingering on his face, his heart a little fuller, his spirit a little lighter, and his faith in the power of human connection restored. A week had passed since Morris had last seen Henry. The elderly man's quiet dignity and unwavering love had left an indelible mark on him, lingering in his thoughts long after their final goodbye. In the days that followed, Morris found himself replaying the moments of their interaction, the image of Henry clutching Evelyn's letter like a lifeline, a bittersweet testament to the love they had shared. Every time Morris walked past the arrivals hall, he couldn't help but glance toward the bench where Henry had sat, cradling his roses and waiting with a patience that seemed impossible. It was as though a part of Henry's story was woven into the fabric of Silverwind Airport itself, his presence echoing in the space he had once filled with quiet hope. Morris knew that for years to come, he would see that bench and remember a story that had transformed him in ways he had never expected. One afternoon, as Morris was finishing his shift, he noticed a small package at the front desk, bearing his name in careful, shaky handwriting. His heart quickened as he recognized the handwriting, Henry's unmistakable penmanship, each letter deliberate and neatly formed. With a mixture of curiosity and anticipation, Morris took the package to a quiet corner, where he sat and gently opened it, careful not to damage the fragile paper. Inside, he found a neatly folded piece of paper and a smaller, well-worn notebook bound in faded brown leather. Morris carefully unfolded the note, his eyes drawn to Henry's words, written with the same gentle care he had seen in the letter from Evelyn. Dear Morris, I hope this finds you well. I wanted to thank you once more for the kindness and respect you showed me during my time at Silverwind. In a world that often moves too fast, you took the time to listen, to care, and to understand. For that, I am grateful beyond words. You reminded me that even after all these years, there is still compassion in the world. I have found peace, knowing that Evelyn loved me as much as I loved her. The letter you helped me find has given me closure, and with it, a sense of completion I had not realized I needed. I can rest easy now, knowing she is with me in spirit, her love forever preserved in the words she left behind. I leave you with this notebook. It's an old journal of mine. In it, I wrote down memories of Evelyn and our time together. It's a record of our love, of the promises we made and kept, and of the dreams we shared. I hope that in reading it, you'll understand the power of keeping one's word, of holding on to hope, and of loving deeply, even when life takes you down different paths. Thank you, Morris. You brought Evelyn back to me, if only for a moment. May you carry our story with you, and may it bring you comfort in times of doubt. With all my gratitude, Henry. Morris sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of Henry's words. The journal was small but substantial, its worn cover a testament to years of use. Opening it, Morris was greeted by Henry's handwriting, the pages filled with memories and reflections that had been carefully preserved across the years. He read the first few pages, immersing himself in Henry's thoughts, his feelings, and the beautiful simplicity of his love for Evelyn. The entries ranged from light-hearted stories of shared laughter to moments of heartache, and every word held an authenticity that felt like a gift. Henry had bared his soul in these pages, his memories a love letter to the woman who had shaped his life in ways no one else could. As he read, Morris found himself captivated by the details, the way Evelyn would laugh when Henry read her poetry, the way she'd brush a stray strand of hair from her face while deep in thought. He could see her through Henry's eyes, a vibrant, compassionate woman who had inspired a love that had survived the passing years. In those quiet moments, Morris realized that Henry and Evelyn's story was not only about love but about loyalty, courage, and the strength to honor promises, no matter how difficult the journey. A few days later, during his lunch break, Morris found himself walking to the bench where Henry had waited all those hours. He sat down, clutching the journal, feeling the presence of Henry and Evelyn as if they were there beside him. He realized that, in a way, they were. Their story had become part of him, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in patience and commitment. As he sat there, lost in thought, a young woman approached, holding a cup of coffee. She looked at him curiously, her eyes catching the cover of the old leather-bound journal. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice gentle. Morris nodded, gesturing to the seat beside him. "Of course." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the quiet companionship oddly soothing. Eventually, the woman glanced at the journal again, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Is that an old family book?" she asked. Morris paused, considering his response. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice soft. "It belonged to someone I met here, a man who loved deeply and waited patiently for someone he cherished. It's his story." "And hers?" The woman looked intrigued. "That sounds beautiful. Love stories like that are rare these days." Morris nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Yes, they are. But they remind us of what's possible, of the resilience of love, and the strength of hope. It's a story I won't ever forget." She smiled, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. Morris felt a subtle shift within himself, a sense of connection he hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. He'd been so focused on Henry's story that he hadn't realized the ways it had opened him up, leaving him more aware of the people around him, of the connections that lingered, often unnoticed, between strangers. The rest of his shift passed with an unusual lightness. Every interaction felt more meaningful, each passing face a reminder of the stories people carried with them, hidden beneath layers of daily life. Morris had spent years in the airport, watching countless reunions, goodbyes, and moments of transition, but only now did he truly appreciate the depth each held. A few weeks later, Morris found himself visiting the community center in Greenfield, where Henry had once mentioned Evelyn had volunteered. He brought with him a small collection of donated books, an offering inspired by Evelyn's legacy. As he entered the small library area, he felt a quiet sense of purpose, as if he were honoring the love that had brought Henry and Evelyn together. He spent the afternoon helping with small tasks, shelving books, and assisting the elderly visitors who came to browse. It was a peaceful space, and he could imagine Evelyn here, surrounded by books and children, her laughter filling the room. As he left, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of carrying forward the legacy of the people who had touched his life. In the years that followed, Morris continued to work at Silverwind Airport, but he did so with a renewed perspective. Henry's story, preserved in the journal and etched into his heart, became a source of comfort and inspiration. It reminded him of the strength of human connection, of the promises that lingered even after the world had moved on. And though he would encounter thousands more travelers, each passing through on their own journey, he knew that Henry and Evelyn's story would remain with him, a quiet beacon of hope and resilience. Every now and then, Morris would return to the bench, sitting with the journal in hand, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that in those moments, he was not alone. Henry and Evelyn's love was there, woven into the fabric of Silverwind Airport, their story a reminder that true love, even in separation, could endure forever.